where the young and the stupid are tricked by the old and bitter into killing each other. It is a topic I said I would never make a video about. A topic I've tried to avoid for the past 3 years on YouTube. The destruction of Yugoslavia. But today I'll give you some information from various sources on which you can base your own opinion. So what did you learn in school about the Cold War? Exactly. East versus West. Communism versus democracy. The USSR versus the USA. But there is one part no one spoke about. Yugoslavia. Started as a communist country but slowly transformed into a country which combined communism with some level of democracy and capitalism. It became a neutral ground with Tito behind the wheel, having both Russia and the US as allies and smartly using them to expand its economy and its international politics. After the Iron Curtain fell, or the wall as we call it, USSR started falling apart. There was still a quite communist country of Yugoslavia in the heart of Europe, with one of the strongest armies in Europe. The worst part for the Americans was that unlike the true USSR's communism, the system actually worked, and people had a decent standard of living, even compared to today's standards.
Yugoslavia, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, was built on an idea. As Ramsey Clark said, very few countries are actually built on an idea. The idea was that the southern Slavs would not remain weak, divided people falling out among themselves or falling prey to some imperialist outsider. That they would join together and they would have a territory that was large enough and strong enough to become a viable nation with its own development.
So how are you going to explain to your people that such a big country exists after having a Cold War and all your propaganda and even the millions of dollars you actually paid to this still quite communist country to distance themselves a bit from communism in the 1950s? Exactly, you don't. You can't explain or convince the American people for doing this.
Yugoslavia was a different case because it had established its own form of a socialist model of economic activity, which was a mixed economy with private capitalist enterprise, with state-run industry, and with worker cooperatives.
It was considered to be a success story of market socialism. It had higher rates of growth than most of the countries of Western Europe. It had an advanced welfare state. It was a multi-ethnic society which lived in harmony, and in many regards it was a model of development.
And sure enough, after World War II, multi-ethnic socialist Yugoslavia was a post-war industrial power, a viable nation, and an economic success. Between 1960 and 1980, it had one of the most vigorous growth rates, a decent standard of living, free medical care and education, guaranteed right to a job, 1 month free vacation with pay. Oh, when was the last time I had a month vacation? Oh, I can't remember. Affordable public transportation, housing, and utilities. Literacy rate over 90%. Life expectancy was 72 years. Most of the economy was in the public, not-for-profit sector.
Standards of living, which many Americans and Europeans only could dream of back then, but also the fourth largest army in Europe, the biggest secret service in Europe, and a president who was friends with basically every leader in the world, were kinda into the way of destroying the country. For the West, during the Cold War, it was just a buffer against the USSR. Besides that, the country had many big companies who traded with Western countries but also competed with companies in the West. With almost no Western companies in Yugoslavia, it was also the perfect new market if Yugoslavia would just end, if you know what I mean. But a country with such a big army, a huge secret service, and a leader which is best friends with basically every leader in the world, you just can't take down that easily. So the US waited patiently for Tito to die, which eventually happened.
When he died on May 4th, 1980, many in Yugoslavia were crying. Maybe not so much for him as much as they were crying for Yugoslavia itself. His funeral was the largest funeral for a statesman in recorded history.
Tito's body wasn't even cooled down yet from passing away, but the West already started its earlier formed plan to destruct Yugoslavia.
The eyes of the world were pointed at Sarajevo, where the Winter Olympic Games were being held. the Reagan administration was specifically targeting the Yugoslav economy in a secret memo, National Security Decisions Directive 133, which stated that US policy will be to promote the trend towards a market-oriented Yugoslav economy. And it was in line with previous decisions directives which advocated expanded efforts to promote a quiet revolution to overthrow communist governments and parties.
US decided to destroy, with the other Western powers decided to destroy Yugoslavia in 1989 when it became evident that it was the one country in Eastern Europe that would not voluntarily overthrow what remained of its socialist system. It was the one country that was still trying for some kind of economic independence outside of the world global free market third worldization process. What I'm saying to you is that there was a conscious and deliberate plan to fragment and break up Yugoslavia. The other blow was in November of 1990, when President George Bush went to the US Congress and pressured them to pass the foreign appropriations law that called for the cutting off of all aid and credits to Yugoslavia. The law also demanded that if any republic in Yugoslavia wanted further US aid, it would have to break away from Yugoslavia and declare its independence. Okay, it's not a conspiracy theory, it's not my speculation, it's not my analysis, it's a public law. It's a public law. November 1990, the 1991 Foreign Appropriations Act. It's written right there. Go look at it.
But why? Yugoslavia was no threat to the European or the American market, or was it?
They wanted a Yugoslavia whose petroleum, engineering, mining, and automotive industries would be undone and deindustrialized. And they wanted to abolish Yugoslavia's public sector services and social programs.
Well, let's just say they used and aided the chaos which was already going on for their own benefit. This is where I draw a line and say that not only the US and Western powers are responsible for aiding and setting up the destruction, but who is to blame? I'll talk about it later on in this video. Let's go back to the industries. Did they succeed to undo those industries?
Yugo car factory, the car that managed to make it into the US market.
The Yugo, it's the road back to sanity.
Bomb that to the ground. Bomb the cement factories, bomb the oil industry, bomb all of the telecommunication systems, so you can sell them the new ones much more expensive, not any better.
They hit the cigarette factory in Niš 3 times. I mean, it ended up being purchased by Philip Morris. Well, if I walk into a supermarket with a hammer and start smashing stuff and then say, look, I'll pay you a pittance for the remains, I'm a Viking or a Vandal.
Apparently, the cigarettes made in Niš were also killing Albanians in Kosovo, so they needed to be taken out.
Obviously, Philip Morris had an issue with the cigarette factory in Niš. It was one of their main competitors in the European market.
This is called privatization through liquidation. World Bank data confirms that under Vukotic's direction from January 1989 to September 1990, more than 1,100 industrial firms were wiped out over a coal mine from the Serbs. Prior to the bombings, Western investors already had their eyes riveted on the massive Trepča mining complex, which constitutes the most valuable piece of real estate in the Balkans, worth at least $5 billion. The Trepča complex not only includes copper and large reserves of zinc, but also cadmium, gold, and silver. The International Crisis Group, a think tank supported by financier George Soros, issued a paper on Trepča making sense of the labyrinth, which told UNMIK to take over the Trepča mining complex from the Serbs as quickly as possible, and that handing Trepča over to the Kosovars is ruled out. And in August 2000, UNMIK head Bernard Kouchner sent in heavily armed peacekeepers wearing surgical masks against toxic smoke to occupy the mine. This was done on the pretense that it was creating an environmental hazard through extensive air pollution. Of course, a healthy environment has always been a top priority of the West in Yugoslavia. Meanwhile, the United Nations had handed over the management of the entire Trepča mining complex to Western Consortium. With a stake in the Trepča deal was Morrison Knudsen International. The new conglomerate was the Washington Group, one of the world's most powerful engineering and construction firms, as well as a major defense contractor in the US. Are any of the Western politicians, businessmen, or lobbyists facing charges for stealing from the Yugoslav people? For crimes against the people of the former Yugoslavia? Nope. Not a single one of them.
We talked about Alija Izetbegović, Tudjman, Milosevic, and many others in my previous clips. I've read the book of Alija Izetbegovic. I know that a lot of these leaders were in jail and convicts during Tito's regime, but that is what made them the perfect candidates to destroy Yugoslavia by digging up conflicts from the past and sparking national and religious extremism.
Zanimljiva za svet. Šta je Jugoslavija za nas koji u njoj živimo?
Za mene Jugoslavija je simbol nezavisnosti.
Ja Jugoslaviju shvatam kao nešto što svima može da pruži sve.
Jugoslaviju stvari vidim stvarno kroz jedan brzi razvoj, brzi tempo.
Samoupravna zajednica naroda i narodnosti.
A ja mislim da nije lako reći da je Jugoslavija.
These same people elected their new presidents within the republics to become independent. The small hiccup for Alija, since Alija Izetbegovic was actually defeated by Fikret Abdic, who then struck a deal with Alija and made him the president for a year in order to switch after a year, which never happened. I made a separate video on this topic, which you can find on my channel. But there was one issue, which was Bosnia, since it was a mix of all ethnicities, religions in one country, a mini Yugoslavia within Yugoslavia.
No better symbol for Yugoslavia than its Central Republic of Bosnia. War erupted into the worst bloodbath in Europe since World War II.
Civil War. Civil War is the worst kind of war. It involves brother versus brother, family member versus family member, and it is one of the ugliest kind of conflicts.
The Serbs wanted to have control over the lands mainly inhabited by Serbs, including lands that were of a strategic importance to them. The Croats wanted the same for themselves, while the Bosnian Muslims, or Bosniaks as they're called today, wanted it all.
Bosnia-Herzegovina was totally intermingled. That idea of partitioning Bosnia into these three parts was a totally artificial thing imposed. If you look, Michel Colon has a map of the ethnic distributions in Bosnia. Totally. I mean, they forcibly extract people block by block. They were so intermingled.
But who were all these leaders which suddenly popped up and ignited the nationalism and religious extremism? Let's just say propaganda will make the people forget about certain details and history about them. I've bought and read the book of Alija Izetbegovic and dug around the history of various other leaders during this time period, because even I could not believe certain statements, which I found, but they are true. Let's take a look at the big leaders that people praised so much and still praise until this day.
In this little book he wrote, there can be neither peace nor coexistence between the Islamic religion and non-Islamic social and political institutions.
Then there's Bosnia, where the U.S. has supported the Muslim fundamentalist Izetbegovic. Izetbegovic, who was with the Waffen-SA when he was younger in World War II. A Nazi, not a collaborator, not a sympathizer, but an active Nazi. And who today now is the president of Bosnia, and hailed as a democratic leader, who wants to establish a religious Islamic republic in Bosnia. Bosnia is now under IMF and NATO regency. It's not permitted to mobilize and develop its own internal resources. It's not allowed to extend credit or self-finance through an independent monetary system. Its state-owned assets, including energy, water, telecommunications, media, and transportation, are all being sold off to private corporate investors at garage sale prices.
And help from his close friend Ivan, the president of Serbia, he got sent to Kosovo in 1987, where Serbs felt threatened by the Albanians. During a scuffle with the police, one Serb asked Slobo why the police was beating them. Slobo then rightfully proclaimed he became an overnight star as the protector of all Serbs. However, this incident with the police was fairly localized. This guy needed a bigger stage. So, because he was so thankful to his friend Ivan, he booted him from the presidency. He also got him killed a decade later. You'd think that after Slobo became the new president of Serbia, he'd calm down. But no. He still needed a bigger stage.
Danas je Krist triumfalno ušao u Jeruzalem, dočekan i pozdravljen od naroda kao Mesija. I glavni grad Hrvatske danas liči na Jeruzalem. Franjo Tuđman dolazi pred građane.
Holy f***.
What was the outcome? The outcome is that in Croatia, you now have the Republic of Croatia with President Tuđman, a Nazi sympathizer who wrote a book saying the Holocaust wasn't all that bad and most of it never really happened. Tuđman, whose flag is the checkered Ustasi flag, which was the Nazi collaborators in World War II, whose army salutes with a straight-arm Nazi salute. Today, Tuđman, who suppressed the more liberal Croatian groups that wanted conciliatory policies with the Serbs. Tuđman, who lives in obscene wealth along with his cronies, while the people of Croatia now wallow in economic misery. In Croatia, it's 5 years in prison if you criticize the president, but I don't hear Clinton talking about the need to bomb Croatia back into democracy.
Yeah, you did not see that one coming, did you? Probably going to trigger you writing a comment saying it's all bullshit. And they're all heroes. Because if you repeat this information long enough, people will start believing it. The problem with you is that you are one of them. You did not realize it until now. Just like today, media propaganda in the region is very active. It helped you make the wrong choices back then and is helping you to make the wrong choices today.
Vukovar. A tamo je i razrušeni Vukovar. U kojem neprijatelj iskazuje i dalje genocidnost, masakrirajući vukovarske Srbe. U kojem neprijatelj iskazuje i dalje genocidnost, masakrirajući vukovarske Hrvate. Slika iz Vukovara sve govori i u potpunosti negiraju sve tvrdnje hrvatske zagrebačke propagande o ubijenim Hrvatima. Slike iz Vukovara sve govore i u potpunosti negiraju sve tlapnje beogradske propagande o ubijenim Srbima.
It is a fact that a majority of the people were against the war, but did nothing to prevent it, while the minority which supported their leaders picked up arms and therefore forced the normal people to pick sides, as well as picking up the arms themselves. I preached in my videos from day one that I can't hate an entire group of people, and judge people only by being good or bad. The Dayton Peace Agreement made it look like everyone in former Yugoslavia hated each other, which wasn't the case.
This is the village of Vrbarje, near Sokolac in Bosnia, inhabited mainly by Serbs and Muslims. After the imposed Dayton Peace Accords, the villagers were aware of what this meant to them. And as the town became part of the Serb entity, the Muslims decided to collectively leave to their own entity.
Eto vas uplakani oba komšije. Ja. Danas se rastajete.
Da, kao tako.
Pa je vam teško?
Kako vidite.
Je li ovo baš lijepo da se komšije rastaju u suzama?
Ovo je sa svega srca, mog i njegovog, sigurno.
Živjeli ste toliko godina.
Koliko imamo godina, toliko smo živjeli. Živjeli smo.
Bez svađe, bez nesuglasica.
Ne bez svađe, ne bez suglasica, nego sa pomoći jedan drugom. Čitavog života do sada je bilo i evo sada je tako.
Kako je sad? Kako vam je sad?
Teško.
Recite po srcu i duši, je li bilo maltretiranja, je li vam bilo ovdje loše?
Nikad. Nije nam moglo bolje biti.
Je li vam žao?
Pa još nam žao rastaviti se s našim komšijama, oni su nama uvijek valjali, dobri smo bili, slagali se, sve.
Jesu vas provocirala djeca, jer ste imali nikakvih problema ovdje, srpska djeca?
Nije ništa, sve smo bili fino, koji ranije što smo bili.
This video footage has never been shown anywhere before.
Nije bilo svađa, nije bilo pritisaka, nije bilo tuča, nije bilo?
Nikad.
Živi ste i zdravi?
Živi i zdravi, nismo imali problema, ni najmanji problem nisam imala. Svi su mi dolazili, i vojnici, i narod drugi, nikad me nije niko vala, ni krivo pogledao, Boga mi. Komšija nam evo došla, evo 2 dana, uvijek imam nekoga od komšija, prate nas, plaćemo svi. Tako.
Rastajete se kao ljudi.
Rastajemo se kao ljudi.
Human beings? Them?
I volio da se sredi ovo, da mi opet i dalje zajednički živimo kao što smo živjeli, da dođe jedno vrijeme, da bude Jugoslavija kao što je bila.
This is why many people from all former Yugoslav countries, even people who fought in the war, realized that they helped to destroy their own country. They elected the people which made empty promises, allowed the US and Western powers to aid them in their fights, while at the same time allowing them to destroy everything worth a penny behind their backs. And some people back then already realized what was going on. Let's just say they were not amused by, for example, Clinton's politics.
Clinton žena I nema srce, nema milosti, šta mu jebem? Izvinjavam se. Ovaj most bude srušen, mi ćemo ga napravimo za 3 sata. Jer tako smo u mogućnosti.
Clintone, i pobedit ćemo.
What did it lead to today? Do we have freedom and democracy now? An open market where we can all learn a lot of money and start businesses like in Western Europe? In Croatia, Serbia, and Bosnia, it's all the same. But since Bosnia is the most complicated, the issues there are the worst from the entire region.
Mi potražujemo danas plate za 2003. 2004. 2005. 2006. I molim vas lijepo 2007. godinu.
Ovo je zemlja koja se zove Bosna i Hercegovina.
U ovoj zemlji se pljačka na sve strane.
I opet će najveću cijenu za to platiti građani ove zemlje.
Ne dam ostavku, neće ova vlada podnijeti ostavku. Neće iz 1000 razloga. Država propada, a vladajući kleptomani se sve više bogate.
Sve trpi, šuti, bit će bolje, bit će bolje. Pa ovo je država za požaliti.
Dubioza Collective is a Sarajevo-based band with a similar message to the one Belgrade Union had.
As long as people think that their impact on democratic processes ends up when they put the ballot in a box, then nothing going to change, because that leaves 4 years gap to whoever is elected to do whatever he wants.
Jedna marka je za neke ljude misaona imenica.
Nismo na ulici, nismo niko.
To nije spriječilo zastupnike da uredno primaju plaće u srazmjeri od 3 do 5.000 konvertibilnih maraka.
The ruling elites don't listen to anybody. That's the thing they learn the best, because they even ignore, mass protests.
Oni vrlo vješto koriste tu jeftinu priču nacionalizma i s njom zaluđuju mase kako bi se sve više i više bogatili. Protiv tih elita smo mi.
Sadly, the elite in power, even when the majority was against them, still didn't listen.
Do I blame America for all of this? No. Do I blame Serbia for all of this? No.
Harmony that the people of Yugoslavia had been building for the greater good was crushed. It is a stereotype that the hatred between the population in Yugoslavia was always there. The South Slavs traveled together to arrive in these lands from the north and found their piece of heaven around the 6th century. Hatred was later manufactured by greater powers, who saw it appropriate to teach the Slavs how to be civilized and democratic. Consider that for the better part of the 20th century, black people weren't even allowed to sit at the front of the bus in the US, while the Dubrovnik Republic actually abolished slavery back in 1642, when the US was still a British colony and didn't exist as a country. The Western hypocrisy was obvious. Why would a Croat really hate a Serb or a Serb hate a Muslim? Because of what someone somewhere did and who knows when? Because of what TV says? Hasn't history shown that these people were in fact able to live together? Or is this all irrelevant the moment someone starts arguing about who did what to whom how many times worse?
To živiš neprekidno u nekoj mržnji? Da li živiš u nekom neprekidnom strahu iza sebe ili nekog jednostavno toliko mrziš da ti se sva tvoja pozitivna energija bazira na tome da to prepoznaš, razlikuješ i da nekom iracionalnom silom manifestuješ tu svoju mržnju. Od toga se ne živi. Od toga žive bolesnici.
There is no such thing as biological hatred, that a certain group is predestined to hate another. Anyone who says any different has an agenda. Trust me.
Čovjek makne ispod kišobrana kolektiviteta koji ga gura prema zlu, može biti plemenit i hrabar.
Da su ljudi bili i da je bilo većina onih koji su razmišljali kao moj suprug, naravno da do rata ne bi došlo.
Corrupt politicians, army generals, or war profiteers were to blame for the colonization of Yugoslavia just as much as the colonists from the West.
Nobody could have done this to us if we were not as weak as we are in defining ourselves and defending our own history. If we, as a nation, stand up no one can keep us down. There is no cruise missile, there is no imperial power, there is no spying network, there is no media domination that can crush our people.
Do I blame Slovenia for becoming the first independent state? No. I blame the people of Yugoslavia for voting for nationalist leaders. I blame the US for aiding such leaders and helping them destroy the economy. I blame Germany for supplying Croatia with weapons. I blame the Serbian forces, the Croatian forces, and the Bosnian forces for committing war crimes no matter at what scale they were. Because the people fighting in these forces were all Yugoslav people killing their fellow Yugoslavs. I still blame the people for voting for similar leaders today and not doing anything to stop them. I blame the people of former Yugoslavia for destroying their own country and then just to bow for these political criminals for the past 20 years and not recognize they are the ones who made the biggest mistakes. They sat down after the war and have been sitting there for over 20 years, blaming each other ever since. My name is Dino and I hope my home will be what it once used to be.